Alright, so today we're going to talk about for loops. Now, as you might recall from our last video, which was about the while loops, we talked about what a loop is and about the fact that there are many types of loops in programming. Now, to best explain what a for loop is, let's consider the following problem. Let's say we want to print every number starting from 1 and ending to n. So, in order to do that, let's declare first a variable called n. Alright, we're going to read the value in n from the screen. Now we can use a second variable which we're going to call I, which will start at 1, and we can use a while loop which has the condition while I is smaller or equal to n. Now what do we want to do in this loop? Well, first we want to print I, which is the current number we are iterating in, so we're going to say cout I, and we're going to separate I from the next number by using a space. And then we want to increment I in order to avoid having an infinite loop. So what this will do is actually just declare a variable called I, which starts at 1. It verifies if the current I is smaller or equal than n. If this condition is true, then it will execute this code. First it will print the current value of I, and then it will increment I in order to pass on to the next number which we want to print. Now if we execute this problem and we give n the value 10, we can see that it has printed every number starting from 1 and ending until 10. Alright, now this is an example of a while loop that has a known number of repetitions. We know how many times it's going to repeat itself. In this case, it will repeat itself for exactly n times. You can obviously see that, for example, when n is 10, we're going to repeat these two lines of instructions 10 times actually. Now, you obviously know that while can be used when we don't know how many times we're going to repeat a program. Now, this is the main difference between a while loop and a for loop. A while loop is often used when we don't know how many times you want to repeat the program. For example, when you want to iterate through the digits of a number, when we don't know how many digits that number will have. The for loop is often used when we know exactly how many times you want to use it. Now, in order to understand how you can write a for loop, you essentially want to take from this example three main components. Those are the initial step in which we initialized I with the value 1, the condition, and the iteration step. So we can actually write the same program using a for loop. So let's first separate this program by using an end line, alright? So this will allow us to move to the next line. And now again, let's consider the same problem. We read an n and we want to print all the numbers starting from 1 and ending to n. So again, cin n. You obviously don't have to declare n all over again since you have declared it right here. Alright, now the for loop is pretty simple. You have to write the keyword for and then parentheses and then accolades. And just like the if statement, you can omit using accolades if you only have one instruction that follows the for loop. There are actually just three instructions you have to write inside these parentheses. The first thing you have to write is the start point, alright? Then you separate it by using a semicolon. Then you want to write the condition. And then you want to write the iteration step. So for this example, how did we start this while loop? Well, we started with I being 1. So the start point will be I equals 1. The condition for which this for loop or this while loop will end is when I is actually greater than n. In other words, while I is smaller or equal than n. Alright? And the step that we have taken, the iteration step, is what we're going to write in here. So for this example, it will be I++. Or you can actually write I plus equal 1, or just I equals I plus 1. You know from the operators video that these three ways of writing I++ are actually equivalent. Alright, so for this instance, we're going to write I++. So what this for loop actually does, it says take all the numbers that start from 1 and to n and separate them with only one value. So for example, if we wanted to print all the numbers that start at 1 and end at n and separate them with the value 2, we could have just as easily said I plus equal 2, which actually says I equals to I plus 2. But in this case, we just want to separate them with the value 1. Alright, the code that we're going to write inside the accolades will actually be the code that will be repeated inside the for loop. So for this instance, first we want to print the value I, and then we want to separate it by using space. And then what do we want to do? Normally we want to increment I, but there is no need for that since we've already written that here. Alright, first let's run this program and see if it works. So first we're going to say 10. N has the value 10, and so far we have executed the program that ends right here. And then what we want to do? We want to read another n, so let's say 5, and it will print all the values starting at 1 and ending at 5. Alright, now let's revise how this for loop works. So this first instruction is actually going to be executed only one time, and that time is going to be when the program actually enters the for loop. Then this condition will be actually executed every time the for loop actually loops itself. Just like the while loop, when it arrives at this accolade, it loops back and checks if the condition is still true. In the same way, the for loop, when it actually arrives at this accolade, it loops back in and verifies if the condition is true. If it's true, it's going to execute this line of code. So again, this line of code will be actually executed for as many times as this condition is true. But there's one more thing that you need to know. After checking if this condition is true, it will actually execute the code and then increment. Alright, now there are ways in which you could have written this for loop much easier or much cleaner. So for example, you could have said outside the loop I equals 1, so you could have written the initial step outside the for loop. Therefore, you wouldn't have needed to write I equals 1 inside the for loop, but actually you needed to keep the semicolon. Alright, so therefore we have written this condition or this for loop much cleaner. Again, you could have also skipped writing the step inside the parentheses, and you could have written it inside the for loop. So you could have written it just like the while loop right here. And therefore you could have omitted this step as well. Now you might think, well, clearly we need this condition. Well, that is actually false. You could have actually written inside the for loop an if statement in which you could have checked if I is smaller or equal than n. And here is where we can introduce two keywords that are actually very useful in loops, both in while loop and for loops. Those words being break and continue. Now the break keyword works as following. When the program actually reads the keyword break, it will actually literally break out of the loop without checking if the condition of the loop has been met or not. So for instance, if we say break here, the program will actually see this line only when this condition is true. So only when I is smaller or equal than n. Well, here you see I have made a mistake. This line of code or this condition will be actually met at the first step when I is equal to 1, and 1 is obviously smaller or equal than n, which will be 10 or 5 in this case. So therefore we have to negate this condition. Now you can do that by simply using the negation operator, which I think I have made presented before, but if not, this is how you negate a condition. And the negation actually just negates everything. If we say smaller or equal, it will negate this and it will become just greater. Alright, so when I is actually greater than n, it will break. Therefore, we do not need this condition either. So if we run this program, again, you will see that it will actually work because we have made an equivalent for loop. So first of all, we type 10, this will execute this while loop, and now we want to test if the for loop actually works. So let's say 5. And you can see it still works. So one very important thing is that you actually really need to keep these semicolons. Alright, now what happens when we say continue? So in order to demonstrate how the continue keyword actually works, let's say we want to omit one number from this sequence of numbers. So let's say we want to print all the numbers starting from 1 and ending to n, and we just want to skip the number 5. Alright, so let's say if I will be actually equal to 5, what do we want to do? We want to continue. What continue actually does is actually skip this step. So it will not completely break out of the loop, but it will actually skip whatever comes after it and jump straight to the condition. So in order to better understand this, first let's comment this while loop since we do not really need it anymore. And actually let's comment this console input right here and let's run this program. Let's first read n, and let's see what happens. Well, actually nothing happens. Actually it allows us to print or actually read many numbers. So let's analyze what happened. So first of all, we declared n and I, that's obvious. We read n and we initialized I by 1. Now we actually got to loop through this loop, but when I comes to be 5, we said that we want to skip whatever comes after the word continue and jump right at 4. Alright, so I will be 5, we jump right back at the 4. We verify if I is greater than n, but wait, we actually didn't increment I. So again, we actually created a small infinite loop. So how do we solve this? We can actually do the following. So we write another instruction. We actually increment I. Alright, so inside these accolades we include one more instruction, which will be I++. Alright, so let's see if this time it will work. So we read the number n, which will be 10 in this case, and actually it worked. It printed all the numbers starting at 1 and ending at 10, but it skipped the number 5. Again, we have one more problem, which is actually pretty intuitive, in which we want to print all the numbers starting from 1 and ending at n, but we only want to print the even numbers. So let's remove all this code right here. Alright, let's just leave int n. Alright, in order to use a small for loop, you can actually do the following. So let's declare the variable I and use I to iterate through all the numbers from 1 to n. So we say for I starting at 0, in this case, so 0 will actually be considered also an even number. While I is smaller or equal than n, I plus plus. Alright, you can actually do plus equals 2, which will actually go from 0 to 2, from 2 to 4, and this is actually a pretty clever way to print all the even numbers, but in this case we want to use the continue instruction. And let's see what we want to do. Alright, so we want to see if I divided, or the remainder of the division of I by 2 is equal to 0. So if the current number is actually even, we want to print I and separate it by a space. Alright, else this means it's odd. We want to actually continue. Alright, let's see if this actually worked. So we forgot to read n. Alright, so cn n. Alright, let's see if it worked. So for example, for the number 5, it will print 0 to n4. Alright, again, you could have used I plus equal to, which is again a clever way. We can comment this and this and this. Alright, and this will do the same thing. So for example, if we again read the number 5, it will print the same thing. Alright, now if you wanted to print the odd numbers, you simply had to make I++. So in order to iterate through all the numbers starting from 1 and then you get n, and just change this condition and say the remainder of I divided by 2 to be different from 0 or to be equal to 1. Alright, now let's check if this actually works. So if we read the number 10, it will print all the odd numbers starting from 1 and ending at 10, but 10 in this case is an even number, so the last odd number will be 9. Alright, that is all for today. I hope you enjoyed and I'll see you next time.